Hi, welcome to our latest Book Reporter Talks to interview. I'm delighted to be here with Allison Pataki, and here we are going to be discussing her brilliant new historical novel, The Queen's Fortune. Let me make sure I get the complete title, Desiree, Napoleon, and the Dynasty, which is a Book Reporter Bets On selection. I'm going to talk about why I love this book. And her previous memoir, Beauty in Broken Places, was also a Book Reporter Bets On selection. So welcome, Allison. So good to see you again.
Thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Really, I loved this book.
Oh, I'm glad.
Okay, if you told me that, Carol, for the last week you were going to be completely consumed by Napoleon, Desiree, and what happened during that time period, I would have said, there is no way. Like, come on. So then I sat down and I started reading, and I was in 75 pages, and then I was in and not doing anything else. And now I have an obsession with finding out everything about Napoleon, Desiree, and all of these people. And the thing is, because they were royalty, we get a chance to really find out what happened to their families since then.
Absolutely.
And it's not that hard to track.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I love hearing that. I love nothing more than to hear that. And it's not your typical European high school history class, right? History is pretty juicy and pretty salacious.
It's pretty salacious. I mean, I have to say that if we were teaching historical fiction, I might have paid a lot more attention when I was in class.
That's why I love historical fiction so much. It's the way in. It's educational, but it's also super entertaining.
Super entertaining, because I think we were talking about battles, and a lot of it was studying what year did this battle happen,
exactly.
Who won the battle, where was the battle fought, and that was really not the interesting part of what was going on.
Yeah, it's the interpersonal stories, it's the drama. People are people, and people are fascinating. And I think history gives us the best raw material to then tell these amazing stories and to be transported and immersed too.
Well, we'll get into your writing later on, because that also makes it, because it's not just this cut and dry kind of writing like in the history books at all. But okay, let's start with, how did you discover Desiree, and how did you decide that you were going to write this story?
Absolutely. Well, my passion is historical fiction, but specifically going back and looking at the woman's perspective. So there's this big push now towards her story, because so much of history has been written by and for men. And so as a consumer, as a reader, as a lover of history, that's what I gravitate towards, but also as a writer, that is what gets its hooks in me. Right. And so my first few books of historical fiction, The Trader's Wife, and then the two CC books, they were really these luscious, juicy historical moments that maybe we'd learned about in history, but we'd learned the men's perspective. And going back and telling them through the eyes of the leading lady, and really putting her, in the case of The Trader's Wife, Peggy, and in the case of the Cece book, Cece, putting the woman center stage. And so just having that track record and having that platform and that brand that I really was in love with, very interestingly, I got this tip for the Desiree Clary story from my father, who's a big history dork. He's a huge part of why I love history. He's a big reader, and he knew that I was always on the hunt for these really salacious but less well-known historical females from just these great stories of days gone by. And so he came to me 4 years ago, and he said, Allison, what do you know about this French woman, Desiree Clary? And I had the reaction that pretty much everyone has had when I've asked that same question. I don't know anything about Desiree Clary. He said, you really have to look into her story, because it's so good that you would not even believe it's true, but it actually is all true. And it's still having repercussions to this day. She's still influencing history and current events and political events. And so as I peeled back the layers, I became completely obsessed with her story.
Now, how he discovered her just recently?
He discovered her in the middle of the night watching an old classic movie where Marlon Brando played Napoleon.
Okay.
And there was this old movie that was based on a book that had been written in the 50s about Desiree, and that's really the only treatment that Desiree has gotten in half a century, was this fictional book called Desiree that was written originally in German. And since then, she's kind of fallen into obscurity. That really old book had been made into a Marlon Brando film, and he had just seen it, and he had, like you, gotten a little bit obsessed and gone down the rabbit hole of Googling, and didn't actually think that this woman could actually be true, that there was this whole juicy backstory with Napoleon's first love, this woman named Desiree. And then when he saw that she had actually existed, he said, "You've got to look into this a little more."
And you know what I found interesting was her last name was Clary. Like
Clary.
it's like
Yeah, Desiree Clary.
You just never thought about these people. It was always Desiree or it was
Desiree, yeah.
Josephine. It was
Yeah.
not. You thought about their last names, where they'd come from, what they had to do for their families. Because Desiree, at the time when we first meet her at the beginning of the book, her family has fallen on dark times.
Absolutely.
And it's up to her to help save the family.
Absolutely. We enter into this story when Desiree is a young woman, and it's the Reign of Terror. So it's the darkest days of the French Revolution. And Desiree was really from this powerful, wealthy Southern family. So they were very much at risk during the Reign of Terror. And what's interesting is in the moment when we enter into this story and Desiree and Napoleon first meet, she is, by society's standards, probably the more powerful figure just because she comes from wealth, and Napoleon is this Corsican refugee who's washed up ashore in France and is a nobody and is not the Napoleon, the single name, as you said, that we know him now through history. And so their stories really begin together, and as Napoleon rises, their stories become more and more entangled, and still to this day, they're still entangled.
Well, you know, it's so interesting because you think of the ego of Napoleon.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was pure ego all the way through of this is what I'm going to do, Napoleon complex. I was reading part of the book and I said something to my son and I said, his mom, remember Napoleon complex?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you know, come on, this is where this guy was, that's where the words came from.
That.
He totally had that. I mean, that's where it came from.
Yeah.
But it was just interesting to hear, like, he first takes up with her. He's with Desiree. She thinks she's the fiancée. She thinks, and then the way she finds out that that's not her destiny, and there's someone else on the scene, and bam, you're off the...
Yeah. So everyone knows the great sweeping love story of Napoleon and Josephine. And that was Desiree's end in terms of her romantic relationship with Napoleon. But she's in this very tough situation because as Napoleon's star is rising and as Josephine's star is rising and they're going on to conquer France, Desiree had been engaged, but her sister had gotten married to Napoleon's brother. And so Desiree's sister, who is her best friend in the world, and Napoleon's brother, who is his best friend in the world through all of the turbulence of their reign, they're married. So Desiree is kind of stuck in this foursome with this most awkward situation of her ex-fiancé, who she thought was the love of her life. She's now pulled into their inner circle, and she becomes one of Josephine's attendants,
and then confidant for a while. And I love the moment where they meet for the first time, like, you know, come for a walk with me, and you're like, oh, this is like your worst nightmare of what's going to happen.
So awkward for both of them.
And I also feel like Desiree was so bright, and I don't feel like felt that a lot of the other people were more clothes horses. They were appendages. They were beautiful women that to have one, but I felt like she was really thinking, looking at the bigger scheme of things that was happening in the world at that time and seeing the bigger picture and seeing the danger in a lot of what was going on.
Yes, and to be able to survive the way she did, and then not only survive, but ultimately thrive and reign, and kind of in the end, ultimately outmaneuver all of them. She was ultimately, at that time, it was a hard time to be a woman, and she was a survivor, but she did it without compromising, I think, her character and her heart and her values, and really knew what was significant and meaningful to her as a woman.
Yeah, and it was not just getting dressed all day long. It was, I love the part where Josephine was changing 3 times a day because that was his rule, Napoleon's
had
rule.
Some very strict clothing rules.
These are clothing rules. You will be changing 3 times a day. Also, I just love the way he pillages and conquers and brings home the art and brings home statues, brings home everything, and just like, you know, here we will be redecorating the home with all these things that I've pillaged from all over the places. And here, take this bauble. The jewels.
The jewels, The jewels, if you've ever been to the Louvre Museum or heard of the Louvre Museum, that is because of Napoleon's plundering basically all of Europe. And then he saw himself as the heir to the great leaders of antiquity. And he wanted to build Paris into the thriving center of a global empire. And so that everything that went along with that, the art, the culture, that he wanted the spectacle. He wanted the bread and circus.
Everything.
Exactly.
And there are a lot of things that I confess that I have spent no time really thinking about the genesis.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, it's him.
Totally.
It's exactly what he wanted to sit there and bring, his vision of what he wanted to do. is vision and is also self-obsession.
Absolutely.
Because it was
Yes.
all about ego, of
Yes.
I need to own all these things as well.
Yes, and the cult of his empire and the image he wanted to craft for himself.
But hello, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go conquer another country. I'll be back. Hi, you go here. I love when eventually they go to Sweden. And remind me of Desiree's husband's name.
Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte.
I want to make sure I have the right pronunciation. So he goes to Sweden, and he says, before you go, let's sign a pact that we're not going to go to war with each other.
Yeah.
I was like, this is precious.
Yes.
I just love that you can go and have this other country. In fact, I'm actually kind of exiling you over there, but you can't ever fight me.
He was putting his people on the thrones of all of Europe so that they would all be his puppets. And then what ended up going wrong for him was that some of those vassal states didn't remain vassals. And so Desiree finds herself in this really terrible conundrum because she is a French woman, but Napoleon has made her and her new husband the king and queen of Sweden. And then suddenly Sweden finds itself as part of this alliance that's at war, all of Europe, against France. And so she just had this fascinating life. You can't even imagine some of the situations she found herself in.
Well, I also did love, too, that her husband's in Sweden, but it's so cold that she decides she's not going to stay there. And she and her sister are going to be spending the summer somewhere in France together. And I really love the way, I just can't. The waters, I can't get on the train. I cannot go. Doctors have recommended I stay here. But I also do wonder what these people did all day long. Because I don't get the feeling that they were doing the needle point or anything like that. They were just seemed to be getting ready for the next event.
Getting ready, looking beautiful, but all of the behind the scenes intrigue. So women carried 50% of the story.
Right.
The men were the ones maybe out front making the decisions, but the women played such integral roles into it. And so Desiree oftentimes found herself also kind of between a rock and a hard place with the men in her life, because Desiree was still related and was still part of the Bonaparte family through her sister and her brother-in-law, but then was married to a king who was at war with France. And so she had to navigate some really, really tricky situations.
Yeah. And it's also, Napoleon's family loathed Josephine. I think loathe is like, a small word. And anything that she could do wrong, anything that she could do to mess up, they were completely all over. So when you walked in the room, there was this tension that you could feel throughout every situation of these people walking in. Like, these were not great holidays to be hanging out with each other.
Don't you think it's so interesting how the more things change, the more they stay the same? Some of the interpersonal royal family drama and the dynamics. And actually, as the writer of Desiree's story, it was a constant reassessment because some of these characters were so big and their personalities were so much larger than life, even in their own, they were legends even in their own lifetimes, that it was constantly sort of harnessing the wind of these amazing stories without letting them completely run away with the ship.
Right.
Because Josephine is larger than life. Napoleon is larger than life.
Those two taking off for the bedroom and burning up the sheets. I mean, it was definitely, there's, okay, well, how do we rein these people back? And then her, crawling at his feet going, I will do this, I will do anything. Because what she realized is her power was vested in him.
Yes.
And as much as there was a woman like Desiree who had a lot of, self-worth or a lot of whatever, she did not, and she'd been in that prison situation. She had been in some very, very dark times.
Narrowly survived.
So as a result, Josephine was constantly cowering, worrying that she'd ever have to go back and be that person again.
Absolutely. She had to fight for her survival at many phases of her life. And some of the stuff that happens in this book, even though it's historical fiction, the most dramatic moments where you can't believe that this is going on between Desiree and Josephine and Napoleon, they're all true. They're all taken directly from the history because it's some of the stuff is so outlandish that I couldn't even have made it up. So all of the moments where Josephine is in these desperate situations and Napoleon and Desiree, and they're in this triangle that they're always finding themselves, where Desiree is constantly privy to these moments that she doesn't want any part of once she's done with Napoleon. That's all true. And that's a case of where history just lands you the best material.
It's amazing material because I said I could not stop reading because it's like these people. It's like, what are you going to do all day long? And then I also love that Napoleon then becomes a designer. And he decides this is what the dress is going to look like, and this is what it's going to be, and what an empress is going to be, and the empire waist, and really,
they said he could be in the middle of planning his campaign to conquer Egypt, which he did, or conquer Russia, which he did. And then he could switch flip the switch and suddenly be writing a letter back home about a piece of furniture he didn't like in his office or something. He had the most singular mind. The way he explained it was like the shelves of a cupboard. He could open one, focus on that, then close it. Then open one, focus on that, and that's how he had this meticulous. We'd probably say OCD now, but he just controlled and thought about everything. He really was brilliant. But then he also had these, it turned into his downfall.
It became pathological at the same point because he also realized that he could maneuver and win. He won countries, he won women. And then if the woman was not exactly what he wanted, he could put her in a place and destroy her in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because, and we also have to talk about this obsession with having an heir.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
It was all about where your destiny was going to be, and it was not just being remembered in history, but was having a child, a male child, that had to be there for you.
He knew because he had taken the throne for himself. He had put himself in power. So he knew how fickle a thing power was and a throne was, and he knew if he didn't have an heir, that it did not matter how much he had accomplished. It would all be for naught if he didn't have a successor to whom he might pass it on. And so it was so interesting because, as you said, he could conquer anyone, anything, a man of insatiable appetites. And yet the one thing he most wanted was a son, and he could not produce an heir with the love of his life, Josephine. And it killed him that the woman he had dumped for Josephine, Desiree, gets pregnant immediately, has a son, goes on to have a very happy life after him.
Right.
And that was the one thing he couldn't control. And so the schemes he went to try to engineer Josephine and him having a son, and it just couldn't work. And so that is also another really interesting plot moment.
It was a plot moment. It was also, she was older. I like that on there when they were getting married, she said she was younger, he said he was older.
Yep,
But
and that
meanwhile,
came back.
he knew how old she was.
Absolutely.
And I also do love that he also names Desiree's child.
Yes.
Like he decides the child's name is going to be Oscar.
Yep.
And please bring that forth.
Mm-hmm. And he's like, I'll be the godfather, even though I dumped you. And
And it was just this complete power game.
Totally.
And she actually, as strong as she was, could not get out of that power game with him.
Yes, yeah. Well, she didn't do herself any favors at first by marrying one of Bonaparte's best generals and one of his closest friends, because then she just solidified her place in the imperial inner circle.
Right.
So what's fascinating is a lot of us, we might know the image of Napoleon crowning Josephine, that really famous painting from his reign. She's standing right there. She's one of Josephine's ladies. Her husband, Bernadotte, is standing right across from her. He's standing next to Eugene, Napoleon's stepson. They were in the inner circle. They were there for all of the most stunning moments.
All the big stuff.
And then they kind of fell out. And then that leads to some very interesting developments.
And one of the reasons they fell out is her husband's distrust of Napoleon. And
and
her
his
husband
honesty.
just sitting there saying, wait a second, this is wrong. What we're doing is wrong. I can't back this anymore. But then you're part of the family. But it's also all the relatives. I love that all of Napoleon's family loathed Josephine.
And they were ruthless.
Absolutely.
Yeah, his mother.
She came in the room and, like, I don't want to have to witness this. We don't want, because, I think they thought that she slept with half of Europe.
Yep, and they said that, they said there are 30,000 streetwalkers in Paris. Why do you have to marry one?
Yep.
They were ruthless in their insulting of her.
And to her face.
To her face, yes.
And I just found that it was interesting because also Desiree had a relationship with him.
Yep.
So when he's sitting there saying, you should marry so-and-so, it was also, she was a sullen woman in a lot of ways because of him.
Yeah, and he kept trying to marry her off to other people too. And he kind of had this special place in his heart for her the whole time, no matter who he was with, to the point where she had his love letters until the very end of her life, and he was writing about her and Bernadotte from his exile, in the middle of his island exile. He was still fixating on them.
Right. Do you think it was because she was smart?
I think that she probably held a very special place in his heart because of the time in which they had been together. They'd sort of both gotten their starts together. During the revolution, and they had kind of risen up together, and it was before everything went wrong for him. She was sort of there with him as he was rising, and then everything got so complicated and bitter and twisted for him. And he really did credit his relationship with Josephine and then his decision to divorce Josephine and leave her with his downfall. He thought that was kind of the end of it for him.
Yeah, because it was like what everybody had expected him to do. The one thing we've touched on a little bit, but these women as seductress of what to do. I mean, when we had Josephine like on her knees imploring Napoleon to do her way or whatever, it was because so much of their lives were hitched to these men of what was going on. Because there was their success, whether they would have one house or 12, where they would be exiled to or whatever. Let's talk about the seductress and what they were doing back then.
Well, ultimately, it was a really cruel time for women, and especially Napoleon could be callous, and once you fell out of his favor, that was it. The door was shut. And I think Josephine was very, very aware of that. She had seen it happen. She had come into her position because he had ditched Desiree so coldly. And so she really wanted to keep her relationship with him. And she was a shrewd survivor. And when they got married, she hitched her wagon to him. And when they got married, she was arguably the higher... she occupied a higher rung of society's ladder, if you will, in Paris at the end of the Terror. She was this great courtesan. She was very sought after by some of the most high-profile political figures of the time, some of these men. She was a very desired date, if you will. And Napoleon was a little younger than her. He was considered uncouth. His star had not risen yet to the point where he was this... superstar general who put himself into the position of a political leader. And then, of course, that balance of power shifts over the course of their relationship, and he continues to just have this meteoric rise, and she does as well as his consort and as his empress. But she ultimately recognizes that she's in a vulnerable position when she is not giving him a son and not giving him an heir. And so, for better or for worse, a huge part of their relationship, always from the beginning, had been the power of their sexual attraction and the power of their physical chemistry. And so she really had to rely on that and lean on that in many ways to maintain her position and her standing within the marriage.
Right.
And of course, once he was no longer interested in her in that way, he pushed her aside and became very, very ruthless and callous about the fact that there were other women.
There were other women, and especially when, imagine her moment of hearing that the other woman had born a son.
Yes, he had all these illegitimate sons, and that terrified her.
And even Desiree's husband was sleeping around. I mean, nobody was not.
And I think in France, that was still
pretty
the
normal.
case.
Pretty normal. It was like, this is the way we live our lives.
Yeah. I was doing an interview in Paris with someone, and one of the men said to me, well, that was Jacques Chirac. It was, I think what they said was 5 minutes including shower. And even just the fact that a French man said that to me so openly, I don't think we would just talk about it that way in America. But French just have a very kind of libertine philosophy on pleasure and sex, and marriage is a little bit maybe less of a stringent definition.
Yeah. It's like, but I am still married to you. Yeah. And it's like, well, I did have all this, but you are coming over. You know? Yeah. You are coming to Sweden. So let's talk about where Desiree's, because we touch on this a little bit at the end of the book. So I'm not giving anything away, but let's go to where her family goes from there. Like, this is like the epilogue that you're getting live right now.
Well, I will just say it then this way, because I know some have read, some have not. Desiree goes to become Queen of Sweden, founds a dynasty, has this son who then is the heir to her and her husband's kingdom, and their last name was Bernadotte. And if you look on Instagram or People magazine or whatever outlet you will, there are some very, very beautiful young royals who are still running around Sweden with the last name Bernadotte. And I will tell you, the Crown Princess of Sweden, who will someday soon be queen, her middle name is Desiree. And her sister, the other Princess of Sweden, her middle name is Josephine. Now, how are Desiree and Josephine still the names of the leading ladies of Sweden and of actually many of the ruling families of Europe? It's pretty unbelievable to see how it happens.
Wow. So it's like generations later, this is what happens. It's like the Elizabeths.
Desiree is still in power.
Still in power.
And Napoleon is not.
And
neither are the Bourbons or any of these other Frenchmen.
Right. And all the places the big lands that were conquered, but Sweden is still Sweden.
Sweden is still Sweden, and also through some very strategic alliances and namely marriages, Desiree's power has spread to many of the European ruling families. It's juicy and it's good, and anyone who loves history, but also who loves a good royal story, it's a good one.
Yeah, I was definitely seeing that. And like I said, this is not something that I thought I would be I can't wait to get back to
Yeah.
this book and see what they're doing. Because let's go to your writing. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
We're going to start first with the research.
Okay.
So
Yes.
do you research using books?
Yes.
Do you research going?
Yes.
What do you do?
So both. Which,
Okay.
it's so terrible having to go to Paris.
So rough.
Someone's
Rough
gotta
assignment.
do
Rough
it,
assignment,
though, right?
yeah.
No, but so strictly a diet of nonfiction. As I mentioned at the beginning, there was this novel written in the 50s about Desiree. I did not read it. I have not read it. I still do not want to read it just because that's a fictional imagining of somebody else's creation. And I don't even want subconsciously to have that floating around in the soup. And so strictly nonfiction stuff. And so what's interesting is you have Desiree in this orbit of royals, specifically Napoleon and Josephine and her husband Bernadotte and all of these other kings and queens of Europe. So all of their lives are very, very well documented. And I could not find a single biography where Desiree was the central subject. Of course, she plays a supporting character in all of their stories, but never once was she the leading lady. So that was a blessing and a curse. I would have, of course, loved a little more information on her, but what was my gift, I think, what was a gift to me as the writer of historical fiction is I was then able to weave her tapestry by pulling all of these threads of how her life had intersected with the others. And so I knew the timeline of events, I knew the facts, I knew the locations, I knew the dates, and then and so that was the bones, and then I really got to imagine the flesh. And I said, okay, I know Desiree was here for this moment. And now I get to imagine how it felt, how it looked, how it was for her as the leading lady to experience it, because she was the leading lady of her own life, and this is her story.
And you knew what was happening before in that place and after in that place, so you could set like that dinner. You could set that moment.
Dinners, oh, I love the family dinners.
The family dinners, and the food is coming out, and they're all in these these sumptuous ball gowns, and these gems and these jewels, and everybody's looking at everybody. And there are very few moments these days. I mean, there are times where I'm driving down the street and I look how everybody dressed to go to work.
I know. Yeah.
No one dresses anymore.
Oh my goodness.
You can go to a 5-star restaurant and people aren't dressed. And yet this was what these people lived for, was getting dressed all day long.
Oh, it took hours. And then they had to change multiple times. And just the jewels, when you think about some of the outlandish expense that went into it, I think Josephine spent more on just her rouge, just her blush, than the average French family made in a year. Just the expense they went to and the luxury of their... And that was also really fun for me as the writer of historical fiction, was to have these really sumptuous, lush settings, because they took for themselves the palaces and everything, the splendor and the wealth of the Bourbons and the great glory days of France, and Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King Louis XIV, and then they went even steps further to make it even more grandiose. And so it's fun as the reader and the writer to be able to enter into these worlds.
And the one thing that I didn't get a sense of, because we were looking so much at the aristocrats, was the people who were serving the dinners.
Yeah.
The people that were ever. And I almost would love to see that through your eyes as well.
Yeah.
Like the downstairs of the Downton Abbey, but the
Absolutely.
downstairs of this place, I feel like your understanding of people and personality and things like that, of who are the people that were really running these homes, because these people were not imagining everything on their own.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And Desiree, even just as she started from the bourgeoisie. She was not noble to begin with, and then she made her way and ultimately became royal. But they really all did. Napoleon started out as a penniless refugee, and then made his way up. So they were very interesting times. And it was also, you had the revolution that was founded on this liberty, equality, fraternity, but then he turned it into an empire that was just as socially stratified as anything that had been in the previous administration.
Okay, so now you've done your research, you've gone to these places, you've taken on the stress of going to France and looking at all these places, visiting every place. When you start writing, are you researching and writing at the same time, or are you just writing at that point?
There's a huge portion of the researching that happens up front. And how I kind of think about it is I'm sort of putting all of the ingredients in, and I'm doing a ton of the reading up front, taking notes, and then kind of letting it marinate and take shape. And I'm thinking about these characters, and I'm thinking about these moments, and these scenes are sort of coming to life based on the historical moments that I've read about. And then I really sit down to write my first draft. And that first draft, I'm really writing to tell myself the story. I am figuring out the story as I go, sort of thinking about it as like I'm holding a candle and I can really only see one step and then I take that step, I write that scene, and then I see the next one, and it sort of becomes clear to me. And that's the first draft. And then I have to go back and completely approach a second draft as thinking, now I'm writing this for the reader, and I'm thinking about the experience I want to create for the reader. And so just knowing how the story looks, then I think about how am I going to help create the experience that I want for the reader. And I really work in drafts. I know writers have all sorts of different processes, but I'm really someone who I've got to fine tune through subsequent drafts.
So you write the whole thing through and then start working through the drafts and expanding the story or whatever.
And there's always research happening simultaneous to that too, because I'll get to a moment and I'll realize, what would a French person in this year have eaten at a formal dinner? And so then there's research that's always little offshoots that are born out of the questions.
So for your writing, do you just leave blank or question, or do you highlight or something like that?
Or I'll
come back
make a
later?
note to myself, or I'll just kind of go back in with a more targeted view of some of the texts, knowing what a specific question that I need to answer.
Right.
You know, like when I knew Napoleon really got to a point where the women of his household and the women of his administration were only allowed to wear French materials because he was all of a sudden very French patriotic. Then I had to research, you know, where would the lace have come from in France? Where would the linen have come from? Where would the silk have come from? Specific questions like that always pop up.
Right. But this is one of the reasons that it's, okay, people can write about history, and it could be as dry as the history books. People could write as just a group of facts. Your writing is so fluid and so beautiful, and the prose is so seamless as I was sitting and reading that I felt I was in time and place, but
Carol,
I felt I was there in a lush way. And there's a lot of times where writing is perfunctory, and this was not. But yet I didn't feel like we were using large vocabulary words just to, you know, impress yourself or impress others. It was more the whole ambiance of the writing. Is that a word? Is that a way of thinking?
Yeah.
The ambiance. It's the way you just felt while you were there, that you felt you were part of the place, but you didn't feel like you were reading a newspaper account, or you didn't feel like you were reading something over the top. And it's very easy to go either of the other ways and be too flowery or whatever. And I just felt like there was this line in the middle. And
thank you.
It's impressive to be able to do that because a lot is not, you know?
Well, thank you. I don't know what to say to that other than thank you. And also I'm a book nerd through and through, and I'm a reader. That's my first love. And so I know as a reader what works for me and what doesn't. And I also know when I'm sitting down to write the book, the sort of experience I want to give to the reader. And, you know, you'll always be reading and you'll go back and you'll say, I don't know how she just did that he or she just did that in my mind, but then you study the sentence to see how it happens. I love the way language works.
Well, it's also clear that you have a history of writing books behind you. And you can see that there's been a progression of your writing as well, because it's, you know, when you sit there and do it the first time, it's like, am I going to get published?
Totally. Yeah.
Am I going to get published? So, and it becomes a bestseller. And then from there, it's like, okay, what am I going to do? What subjects are going to look at, and how am I going to work on them?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the Sissy books, because I want to know more about these.
So I would say The Queen's Fortune, if I'm likening it to anything, it's the most similar to my Cece stories, just because it's this great woman, it's her story at its finest. It's going into this really sumptuous setting that we don't have the opportunity to live in on a normal, you know, as normal mortals. And it's going back to a moment in history that we might be familiar with, but telling maybe the woman's perspective is not as familiar to the reader. And so I absolutely loved writing the Cece books. Her life was so long and so dramatic and so juicy and good that I did break it up into two, just because nobody wants to read a book the length of Gone with the Wind these days.
Did you always know it was going to be two? When you started writing, just say, I want more from her.
I knew when I ended this book that it was not the whole story, but I knew I had an uphill battle because I had to make this book a success so that I could justify having the second one. Right. And so I I had written them both. I loved them both. I knew that her story had more to it. And fortunately, the publishers agreed. and fortunately, the readers agreed, most importantly.
And it's nice because if you're reading, when you discover this, when you discover this, it's nice that you will have 2 other books to go back to have that same kind of writing and feeling from.
Thank you.
Which I think is important, because when people sit there and they fall in love with an author, it's like, what can I go back and read?
Absolutely.
What I go back and do?
Yeah.
And then this book, Where the Light Falls, I did some looking up on this. We're at the French Revolution, but you wrote with your brother.
Totally different experience. My brother was deployed to Afghanistan. We're both history dorks. We both are total Francophiles. Our family has a really strong connection to our relatives who still live in France, which is how I could justify traveling too. Yes. And so we had done this together. My brother's a filmmaker. And he has always seen this as a screenplay and always had seen it as a film. And we kind of came up with this story together. And I said, let's do it first as a book, and then you do it as a screenplay. And so this was a fun project that we did together. And it was interesting having a co-author who was deployed in Afghanistan.
Right.
But 50% of the story is Owen's. So it's different. It's not her story.
No, and he was also writing, if I read correctly, the battle scenes.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to write a battle scene,
which
is
I
just...
don't really read that type of stuff either.
No,
I enjoy it.
There's some battle scenes, but it's
she
not
wasn't
like
there.
she wasn't there. She was hearing about the battle and who conquered later on. Yeah. But here he was able to flesh out those parts of it.
Absolutely. And it's interesting what he reads as a reader of fiction and nonfiction versus what I read. And so you could see very much the influences are woven together. Right. And that's different in that it's not based on a true life story. This is a fictional 3-part story of 3 different characters that is historical fiction too, but not in the genre of one person's story.
One person's story, being able to tell one person's story. It's so funny because so many times, and this is going to sound terribly sexist, and do not come after me for this, but men will see something completely different. And it was years ago, I was reading a thriller, and the woman was naked in the book. And it was a scene where she didn't need to be naked. So I was talking to the author about it, and another friend, male, who had read the book, and neither of them saw there was anything, they didn't even notice that was going on. And to me, I took it as such an affront. So it's interesting when you're writing together, when you're doing something different, you're looking at one side of the story, he's looking at something else. He doesn't really want to be writing yours, and you really, it's like, fine, you're doing a really good job with yours. I'll be happy to read it.
And you know what else was so interesting about that was that he was seeing scenes, when we'd be talking, he was seeing scenes as a screenwriter. And so he was seeing it through a camera and visually, and I was seeing it as a novelist and thinking, how am I going to build this with words in the reader's head? Yeah. And that was really interesting and a learning experience for both of us. And then speaking of the screens, these are getting adapted by Amy Jenkins, who wrote for The Crown.
Wow.
So another really big, sweeping, royal story, but a really fascinating leading lady who deserves her time in Empress Sisi.
And do you know where it's going to be airing?
We're almost done with the screenplay, and then we have to decide the network.
Decide network and decide what to do.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting time.
It really
what
is.
Do you want to do?
Yeah.
Do you want to be streaming and delivering everything at the same time? Do you want it to be an episode a week? What do you want to do?
And then there are movie theaters too, don't forget.
The movie theaters too, which way to go. And the other night I was watching the Golden Globes, and it was just fascinating to sit there and see Netflix is nominated for all these films, and then the studios are winning the awards. So, but there's this moment of time of you just want people to be able to get something wherever they want it. You want to be able to consume it as quickly as you can, and be able to enjoy it in whatever format you want. No different from books. Do you want it as an audiobook, an ebook, or print?
Right.
And it is the same kind of experience that I'm seeing that's working in theater, streaming, or how quickly does it go from theater to streaming so that more people can go see it?
Yeah, and people just really, I feel like right now, are craving good stories. And I love that there is this return to really deep, rich, meaty stories, a lot of which are based in history, and people are really going towards moving, heartfelt stories.
Well, you think about it. Your father discovered this story watching a movie. Okay, that's how this all started, was watching a movie. I know that when I finished watching The Crown, somehow, because Netflix, like, just tracked my life, it popped up, The Windsors. There's a documentary
I've
on
watched
the Windsors.
it. Yes.
And I thought that was really great of filling in the rest of the pieces of the things that I didn't really know. So it was, well, wait a second, that was fictionalized there, but it really wasn't fictionalized. This is really the way things went down and how they happened. So and you also got a glimpse ahead of what The Crown was going to be like the next season.
Yeah.
You figure
And
where it's
there
going.
is such an interest with just because you have royals like the Windsors or like Desiree and her whole Imperial clique, because their lives are so removed from our everyday lives, and there's this barrier to entry. There is this fascination with, through those programs or through these books about them, we get to enter into them for a day,
Yes,
or forever, however long we're occupying the story, and that is a real treat, I think, and it was fun to imagine it, and that's why as a reader or a viewer, I also think it's fun to consume it.
Well, it's smart reality television as opposed
Exactly.
to...
It is a form of reality television.
It's a form of reality television, but it is not this completely scripted. My husband was at a restaurant one night, and they were shooting a reality show. And he said, if it's a reality, why do we do 20 takes? And he was sitting in the background with my son, and they had a sign of release. And he goes, well, why are you doing it 20 times if it's a reality?
Oh, my goodness.
And it was like, let's do it again. Let's do it again. And he's like, well, I had a big different view of reality television after watching that.
So interesting.
But it's really what we are really obsessed with as people right now is what people are doing.
Yeah.
You think about what social media is. You think about what these people would have been like on social media.
Oh,
you think about how we
right.
would have heard everything about their lives all day long.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now you have royals making life-changing announcements via social media.
That's
it's
exactly.
changing the way people communicate.
It's changing. It's like, this is what we're going to do, because everyone has more control over their own destiny and how they shape their story, for better or worse.
Right. Even
And
as
it is
authors,
for better and worse.
we have that. Now there's this whole expectation. We write the book, but then there's this whole second or next phase of it where we have to present so much of our lives and communicate and connect, and that's a wonderful gift that social media gets us, is we have a direct line of contact with readers now.
Right. When we first met, it was at the party for, I think it was the party for Sissy.
Yeah.
And I remember saying, oh my gosh, she has the best life, all these kind of things. And somebody said, yes, especially after all she went through with her husband. And I'm like, wait a second, her husband? Like, what are they talking about? And they mentioned your husband.
Yeah.
They had the stroke, blah, 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 which this book was born from.
Yeah.
And it was just like hearing that story that night and saying, wait, what happened?
Yeah.
And then being able to read this absolutely beautiful memoir,
Thank
a
you.
love story, and this beautiful memoir that where you chronicle what happened that year and what was going on in your life. I think my favorite line was when you were pregnant with your child. You had been pregnant with your first child when your husband had his stroke, and then with the second child he's like, wait, I'm at 5 months now, I know what this is all about. And you wrote in a beautiful way about this very difficult time, but at the same time a very real way of writing. And what I felt was, you could picture, I felt I was in your shoes, but I also think that writing these gave you the opportunity that when you were writing here, you could write from the heart and write real.
Absolutely. I never ever thought I'd write a book like that.
No.
And I never intended to, and I never thought we'd live through what we lived through that then produced or that led to this book. But yeah, I mean, that was just something that I think I used writing to survive and cope and process and heal.
I remember Lee Woodruff said to you right at the beginning, just start writing everything down.
Yep.
And if you start writing everything down, then you're going to have what happened later on. And I felt that when I was reading this book, I was sitting there saying, when you were talking about your notes and everything that came together and whatever, it was sort of like you're doing your writing at that moment was the same kind of thing as you were charting your path to go back to look at later on. And if there were bumps in the road, let's look at where we were. And what I felt with in reading this is it's sort of like a progression of writing, and people's writing progresses. And though there was a detour here of what ended up happening, a detour, there was a book that came from there. And then after that, there was a book. And then from here, and writing becomes richer because you're also infusing, there's personal experience. Like, how did people feel when they were in these difficult emotional situations? Because you're writing from a place where even deep down inside of you, it's there.
Absolutely. One thing that really got to me was there is a stroke that features prominently in this book, and I just couldn't believe that the way life and fiction were mirroring each other at that point, because I wanted to write this book years ago. And then life happened, and it's been 4 years, and I've been walking around with this story in my head, and then I had a baby, and then I had another baby, my husband had a stroke. A memoir came as a result of that.
Right.
Children's books have come as a result
I want to talk
of
about
my
those
life.
too, right.
And so this is really meaningful to me, to be able to be in the genre that I love, telling a story I've wanted to tell for so long, and as you said, at the moment in my life that I am now able to do it.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, when I'm sitting there reading it, I'm seeing so much emotion on the page. And I think that it's emotion you had to go through at a much younger age than most people have to feel from it. So as a result, you bring that experience and that the empathy and the understanding. And you could see that, like, we're writing about people here. There's a depth of understanding. There's a depth of emotional understanding. And I think that that's really important. I do like at the beginning, though, that the one old man that she almost had to marry, like, gone. Like, boy, was that a luck?
You cannot make this stuff up, what happens with that scene. And how different life would have been.
How different life would have been. Yeah, so there are those moments also of like, wait a second, what happened here, folks?
Yeah. The swells of that life.
The swells of like what happened. So now, children's books.
Yeah.
So how did this end up happening?
I have,
this is a Renaissance woman, everyone.
Writing has kind of been my compass, and I've just kind of followed like every single book is a totally different, unique story of its genesis, and every single one was sort of the book I had to write at that moment. And so I have launched this children's book series called Big City Adventures. So far I have New York is Nellie Takes New York, that came out this past May, and then I have Poppy Takes Paris coming this May. And
because you had to take the children to Paris, right?
Maybe
just to see what they saw.
In like 20 years. And so they are two stories of adventure, finding adventure in these world-class cities. Each one is a little girl who wakes up and is a savvy local of the city and then uncovers something that she didn't know. So, for instance, in Nellie Takes New York, she finds out that New York is called the Big Apple, and she doesn't know where the Big Apple is. So she takes off with her dog Bagel to find the Big Apple in New York. And so she has this day of misadventure and mischief and ends up uncovering all sorts of truths about New York in the process before she comes to realize that it's not actually the literal Big Apple. And then in Paris, Poppy and her faithful little mischievous dog Baguette, they take off to find the brightest light of the city. So the city of light, they want to find the brightest light, and they have this series of adventures throughout Paris. And what I love is I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And so it's a really nice way to introduce children to the great cities of the world, whether you live there or whether you've never been there.
Right.
And it's fun. It shows kids that they can find adventure right outside their door.
Right.
It awakens hopefully an interest in travel and in places other than just what you know, and just super fun. And I had written the memoir about almost losing my husband and the birth of our first child in the midst of that. And then I did the children's book next, and it was like jumping into an ice cream sundae.
I love it.
And just reading to rooms full of children, there's nothing quite like that. So it was
like they look like this.
The energy, and it was fun. It was
so wait, Libby goes to London, and what is her bread product?
Oh, you got it. So in London, there are fish and chips. There's a duo.
So I'm getting it. I'm getting it.
But it's going to be Lily.
Lily.
Yeah.
Okay, not Libby.
My daughter is Lily.
Lily.
Yes, so that works.
So she can do a read aloud at school.
Yeah.
This will be totally perfect. My mom's going to come in and read a book about me going to London. You know, this is like what happens along the way. Well,
I guess, I grew up, I knew the trials and travails of being a politician's daughter. My daughter will know the trials and travails of being a writer's daughter.
He's
getting dragged along to book readings.
Yeah, this is what I'm going to do. And eventually she'll have to be reading aloud herself.
Yeah, it could be worse, right?
Yeah, it could be. Believe me, it could be worse. When I started this company, I guess it was 24 years ago, when the internet was a baby.
Yeah.
Like to sit there, and I remember going someplace and somebody was talking about all the children being on MySpace, and that their children were on MySpace. And I'll never forget, I was at this middle school, parents' night, and I said, let me tell you something. My kids don't instant message or anything. I've made this look so boring because it's all it's all work related that they really couldn't care less. What you're going to do.
I think that worked out pretty well for you, though.
It worked out pretty well. But it is really funny because people think that things are so big and so hard, and I'm like, no, you just go do it. You just every single day. And it's like sitting down at your desk every single day and working and writing.
Right. A lot of times people will say, how do you write these? Or when do you write these? Or I see you. So when is this happening? And I'm like, it's the same thing as you. You go, You go to work every day.
Right.
I go to work every day. I sit down, I report to my desk, and I work in whatever phase I'm in. If I'm on a researching phase, if I'm on a rough draft phase, if I'm on an editing phase, and then there's all of the work that comes into actually launching the book and then speaking about the book and connecting with readers. I'm a full-time working mom, just the way any full-time working mom is.
And do you stop at a certain point in the day? Like if you still have an idea and you can still keep going, do you have a hard stop?
I have a hard time stopping if I'm really in the flow, but I find that just my natural rhythm is that I'm most productive in the morning. I hit kind of a wall by the afternoon, and then that's easy, more like administrative stuff.
Right.
Not the like heavy lifting of the creative, kind of blocking out the story. And then I've got my kids, so there's a hard stop at the at the end of the school day.
To me, I've always been the night owl.
Yeah.
Always.
Oh,
when
so
I was in
yeah,
college,
everyone's different.
everything. It was always.
Oh my gosh.
It was like 3 a.m. was my moment, and it's
Isn't that interesting? How
and
different
and
people
morning, not really. Don't turn it on that well in the morning.
Give me a cup of coffee and some good music, and that's
you're on.
when I'm. That's
and
when
you
I
can
have to
listen
work.
to music as you write.
So I have to listen to music. I don't like music with words,
Okay.
but for instance, this because we're in the era of Napoleon, and then we're in Russia for some part of it. I did a lot of Tchaikovsky. I get kind of in the mood of whatever I'm writing. Cece, it was a lot of Wagner and Strauss and Liszt, and I get kind of these like playlists that work with inspiring whatever the topic is. So I did a lot of Chopin, Debussy.
Is there a playlist? There's a Spotify playlist on your website?
I'm an Amazon Alexa.
There you are.
Yeah.
There you are.
With the
Well,
user.
I loved at the back here you have a number of references. So if
Yeah.
you finish reading the book and you want to read more about these your research project, it's all in the back. And I
Yeah.
really liked that because it was like, because you definitely intrigued me, to learn more.
So you might not necessarily go towards a dry biography first, but once you've had the way in through historical fiction, the material becomes more interesting and personal, and then you would go towards
You
a
would
biography.
sit there and say, this is what I want to do.
I love that.
Do you talk to book clubs?
I love speaking to book clubs.
And
yes.
if book clubs want to get in touch with you about talking, I always say to people, read the tour dates first. She's not going to do it while she's on tour. But after that...
website, so my website, AllisonPataki.com, there's a form right there that we can communicate, or any social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I connect with people that way too.
Right. What I always say is make sure you say what time zone you're in and which book you want to discuss.
Oh, yeah. And shameless plug, there's all sorts of good book club material out there for this book, as there was with all of the previous books, because we came up with some questions. We have a fun French lemonade recipe that we're going to have for book clubs, all sorts of supplemental material, an interview. So it's a really good book club book.
So if you're going to sit there and have the conversation, and trust me, you're going to be looking, it's so juicy to be sitting there to read.
Goodness, I hope. Then you can have a big juicy steak or something
Something like that.
Something French.
That's exactly. Oh, I think definitely cocktails.
Yes,
Definitely
some wine.
Yes, or champagnes.
Champagne.
The absolutely correct champagnes.
Uh-huh.
Thank you so much for joining me
Thank
today.
you.
It's been such fun. I can't wait to hear readers' reactions to these books. I want to hear from you after you read. And thank you for joining us.
Thank
and
you
I look
for
forward to
having
seeing
me.
what comes next.
I'm excited.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.